In the previous video, I had introduced some key arguments that are going to be made as we discuss this narrative of Japanese internment. But also, before we engage with this narrative, I want to also introduce some keywords, and some of these I've already introduced. For example, Issei Nisei, let's remember that refers to the first generation versus second generation. In fact, the Japanese Americans actually created new words to describe the first generation compared to the second generation. So Issei, of course, refers to the first generation, that is, the immigrants coming over. Nisei refers to those born in the United States. So they're American, they have American citizenship, as guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship. And many of them, as we discussed, are very acculturated to U.S. Society. They're assimilated to U.S. culture, very American in their outlook. In fact, some of them couldn't even speak Japanese. Moving on, I also introduced this earlier. This is the executive order issued, of course, by the president, Roosevelt at that time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which would basically require all persons of Japanese ancestry to report to the assembly centers first, where they're going to be, assembled and kept there temporarily while they build the concentration camps, and then eventually, once the camps are built, the prison camps, well, they're going to be whisked away from the assembly centers to those concentration camps. So this is the order that mandates all persons of Japanese ethnicity to report. Now, fifth column is an interesting term that actually was first used during the Spanish Civil War, which happened just a few years earlier to this episode of Japanese internment and World War II. Spain had a civil war, the fascist against the anti-fascist. And a term emerged here in that conflict called fifth column. And fifth column refers to basically domestic sabotage and espionage, okay, within the country, that is. So this term would, as you could readily imagine, would be cast against the Japanese in the United States. Could they constitute a fifth column in the United States? Could they be spies and saboteurs for the Empire of Japan? Even though, like I said, the Nisei were born in the United States, they're thoroughly American. The Issei are immigrants, but most of them have been living in the United States for decades. Well, as we'll see, they certainly were never a form of fifth column. But again, I'm jumping ahead. All right, the politics of incarceration, I'll get to that in a second because there's a separate slide to that. But I'll jump right to Orientalism because this is going to connect with General DeWitt and his argument for military necessity. Orientalism is something I introduced earlier in the course, but here is the framework of Orientalism. Orientalism is an ideology, it's a worldview, it's a system of beliefs that arose during this age of European imperialism, overseas colonialism and imperialism that happened really since 1492 through its peak, which was like around World War I. World War I is when you see the collapse of, the European imperial system. In fact, World War I was basically a war between different empires in Europe. That was global. It was a world war because of the colonies abroad, right? In any case, Orientalism emerged, and that's the view that the world is divided into two partitions or two segments. That's the Oriental world, and the opposite of that is the Occidental. And by the way, that's spelled Occidental, the Occidental. Okay, or you could just call it the Occident versus the Orient. So the two are, again, so different from each other. And let me remind you that Orientalism is a European worldview. They came up with this view as they colonized the world outside of Europe. And when they went to parts of Asia, even the Middle East, which is considered Oriental, so to speak, they couldn't help but notice that the Oriental world, so to speak, again, was so different from the Western world, from European societies, European culture. For example, not only racially did the people look so different, but their culture, like, for example, their handwriting, right? It's not using the same kind of script that we see with, with European handwriting. The language itself, very harsh to their ears, the European ear, perhaps even dissonant, and unattractive sounding to them. Think of anything from architecture. It looks different, right? The buildings, the houses, to even the way they dress, so different. The foods are so different. Oh, they eat with chopsticks, and they have different types of, you know, um, types of food that Europeans thought was so strange. So it's this, if you will, exoticism that led them to conclude that the so-called Oriental world was so different that it could not really meet the Occidental world. There could be no meeting ground between the two. The two are at fundamental variance with each other. Okay? So that's the view of Orientalism here. That, there's the Occidental world, the Oriental world, and the two will never meet. And there's a corollary to this ideology or worldview. And it's this, that you can't take that Oriental person and situate them in the Occidental world or the Western world and expect that Oriental to fully assimilate. Okay, they're forever Oriental. They're forever foreigner. All right. And hence you have this stereotype here of Orientals, or you could just say today, persons of Asian descent, as quote unquote perpetual foreigners. Where do you think that came from? It came from this worldview of Orientalism. Okay, so this notion that persons of Asian descent are forever foreign. Okay, now this sounds preposterous to us today, for most of us, right? Especially in California, especially in a big urban area like Los Angeles or San Diego or San Francisco, where there's so many persons of Asian descent. Of course, Asians could assimilate. In fact, I'm speaking right now, and I'm a second generation Asian American. My parents were immigrants. But back then, most people in the Occidental world could not imagine it. Okay. I will say, though, in some parts of the world that's Occidental, so to speak, you don't hear that term a lot anymore. Occidental. Well, there is Occidental College, right, in Los Angeles, but again, you don't hear the term Oriental and Occidental that much. That's because it's outdated. But in any case, perhaps in some areas where there's not a lot of Asians, some people may still believe in perpetual foreigner or take that as an assumption about persons of Asian descent. In fact, I personally have had people who are visiting California from the Midwest with no Asians, or let's say from the South, and they say, "Hey, you speak really good English," right? As if I'm, a foreigner, right? Or I've heard other persons of Asian descent tell stories about similar incidents when they go to areas where there's no Asians in that part of the United States. Okay, so again, that's where this comes from. Now, hopefully you can see how this is going to eventually connect with internment, because it's going to be assumed that Japanese, being Oriental, are indeed foreigner. They're not American, right? How could they even be American? It's impossible. It's inconceivable according to Orientalism. And indeed, we'll look at some of this general who was in charge with West Coast security after Pearl Harbor, General John DeWitt. And of course, he has to come up with the rationale as to why the Japanese Americans should be evacuated from the West Coast and sent eventually to prison camps. Well, he stated his official reason as military necessity. Of course, that translates to what we call national security today. But as we'll see, if we analyze his rationale, his articulations as to why this is a case of military necessity and the Japanese should be indeed rounded up, well, it's laden with Orientalist beliefs. Okay, we'll get to that later. Now, as we'll also see, however, we're going to see cases of agency or resistance, that is, Korematsu and Endo court case, as well as other examples I'll discuss. And we'll see cases of heroism and, bravery of Japanese Americans, okay, who would actually volunteer to fight in the war. They won't fight in the Asian theater, or the Pacific theater, excuse me. They'll be fighting in the European theater against the Nazis. But we'll see how they turn out to be one of the most decorated regiments in military history. And that's the 442nd Regiment, comprised of Nisei soldiers. Now, this slide right here is going to delineate some of the legal issues, really, and the political issues behind Japanese imprisonment and incarceration. And again, let me remind you that this event is unprecedented in U.S. history at the time, and still has not reached to the same degree, afterwards. Okay, so this is what I call the politics of incarceration, because it's dealing with legal and political issues. Let me remind you what's going to happen. You're going to round up and imprison an entire social group that's based on race, right, and national origins. But even, actually, I shouldn't say national origins, because many of them are Nisei, right? They are born in the United States. Okay, so if you're going to imprison someone in our country, of course, they have to be charged with a crime. So that's one of the issues at stake here for the Issei and Nisei who are going to be imprisoned. What crime did they commit that justifies wholesale incarceration, right? Were they given the right of due process, habeas corpus, all those things that are guaranteed by the law, by the Constitution? No. Okay, they will not have their right to a fair trial, to be judged by a jury of their peers. So that's another issue. How to claim guilt without giving a chance to prove their innocence? They didn't have a trial, right? And then, as I keep mentioning, you're talking about the violation or infringement of constitutional rights for an entire racial group. How do you do that? How do you justify that in, say, the court of law in the United States? What about the property of Japanese Americans? Because, the Japanese are going to hold property, homes, even businesses, automobiles, and what have you. What's going to happen is all that stuff, as we'll see, will become confiscated unless the Japanese were able to sell it within, let's say, a week, right, at bargain prices, so to speak. But let's remember how sacred property is to the American mind, right? Private property. What about their property, right? Now, as we're going to see here, and as I have alluded to previously, what's going to override the Constitution is military necessity. That is to say, all these factors here, legal and political, that's, listed here, well, it's going to be justified as being swept aside for the sake of national security, because the United States viewed this as a period of crisis, and therefore something needed to be done immediately. Well, this means that we have to hold the Constitution in abeyance, if you will.